it happens from time to time that there's a provision in the instructions to tenderers that require that your tender must be sealed if you're a company. And of course that has implications for the no validity of the period for which the contract exists later on. But it is stated in the particulars, and you're told whether or not the tender must be sealed. Now, it doesn't, probably most tenders aren't sealed, I would say, in my experience, but I might be wrong on that. But if you're told that you must seal your tender, and you haven't sealed the tender, then you may well find that your tender will be rejected. So, you know, just check the particulars and make sure that if you're told that it is sealed, that it is sealed. Non-compliant tenders. The one thing there is that the employer, and he may disqualify non-compliant tenders, but he's not obliged to disqualify non-compliant tenders. So, you know, if you have somebody who you know, doesn't complete, if you like, the pricing quality document correctly and enters, let's say, nil instead of 0.0, he could be disqualified, but then again he may not be. The employer doesn't have to disqualify him. And I mean, no, that creates, I suppose, a debate sometimes when people think kind of that somebody, you know, who bid a tender lower themselves should be disqualified, and maybe they should, if you like, if their bid wasn't compliant. But the reality is that the contracting authority doesn't have to disqualify a non-compliant tender. There is at 8.1, you know, a fairly good description of how errors will be corrected. And you know, the errors may be extension errors, or they may be arithmetic errors in the adding up of the totals, or whatever. But the one thing kind of that can't be changed is the tender sum. Unbalanced tenders, well, that happens from time to time. And if an employer thinks that a tender is unbalanced, he may request a breakdown of the items. He might invite you to adjust the items, the rates in the items, but of course you can't change the tender sum. And if he's not satisfied, he may reject the tender. Abnormally low tenders, well, an employer may require an explanation or justification of rates or price that he considers to be abnormally low. In other words, if he considers, you know, that it's below cost and below your capacity to do it, he may examine it, and he may ask for an explanation. But he's not obliged to reject it. He may reject it, but he's not obliged to reject it. And just because a tender is examined, if you like, kind of, and you know, even in circumstances where an explanation hasn't been, let's say, fully given as to how the contractor can do the job for the price that he's bid, his bid can still be accepted. Now, the award criteria, on the short form, the award criteria is always the lowest price. Always the lowest price. Now, maybe I might know, it does state in the form of tender that the employer will not necessarily accept the lowest or any tender. That is not to say by any means that he's entitled to accept a tender other than the lowest. It means that he can cancel the competition. He doesn't have to accept the lowest tender, and he doesn't have to accept any tender. The award criteria on the short form is always the lowest price. And if he's going ahead with the competition, and unless that lowest price is invalidly tendered and rejected, if you like, on the basis that it was not a valid tender, then the contracting authority has to accept the lowest price. And people need to be clear about that. And in my experience, it often happens that contracting authorities aren't clear on that point. The letter of intent. You may or you may not get a letter of intent. And normally you do, and the letter of intent will look for the insurances, tax clearance, the appointment of PSCS, and maybe a performance bond if a performance bond is required. But you have to bear in mind that the letter of intent is not, it does not create a contract between you. What creates a contract in this instance is the return to you of the back of the form of tender, which is headed acceptance by the employer. And once that comes back to you, it's a binding contract, and a contract is in place. There's no form of agreement that you sign as in the other contracts, you know, where you have a form of agreement. And now, even in the other contracts, I mean, if the offer is accepted, it'll be a binding contract. But you still may go and sign the form of agreement and put it on the file. That doesn't happen in this contract. What creates a contract between you is acceptance on the tender acceptance form by the employer. And at that stage, you have a binding contract. The form of contract that you're signing up to is the one that's on the government, on the GCC website, 10 days before tender. Now, that might not be the same form of contract as will be there in 4 or 5 months' time when you're doing the job. And it may not have been the same contract that was there 4 or 5 months earlier. So, in all of these public contracts, because these contracts are not published documents, they're not contracts that you can buy, if you like, kind of, and they're not contracts that, if they're changed, you will get a book of amendments to. These are contracts that change, I won't say from day to day, but they change on a regular basis, and they're updated. So the contract form that you're bidding is the one that's there 10 days before tender. So, you know, if you're taking your business seriously, you should download the form of tender on that date and keep it. In the particulars, you'll be told the documents that must be submitted with the tender. And again, like, to make sure that your tender is valid, you really need to be pernickety about that. The format of the tender submission, you'll be told that. And that's where they explain to you that the qualification form has to be in a separate envelope to the tender itself. And if you don't do that, you know, technically it's a non-compliant bid. Make sure your suitability questionnaire is right. I emphasise that at the start. And your tender is always conditional on you meeting the suitability assessment criteria. And if you don't have that right, and indeed if you're required to submit a suitability assessment for any specialist that you might have to have, that you have that included as well, and that's right. Because if you don't have that right, your tender won't be opened. And then, of course, if you're asked to seal the tender, make sure that the tender is in fact sealed. In an open or restricted competition, there cannot be post-tender negotiation. You cannot negotiate a change in the tender sum. There's no post-tender negotiation in an open or a restricted competition. And you can be asked, you know, to clarify your proposals or your rates. And no, that can be done. And there can be an adjustment of unbalanced items. And there can be a rejection, an examination and a rejection of an abnormally low tender. But a tender sum cannot be changed. Now, we all know that it happens, and it shouldn't happen. You know, that the bids come in, and that all of the bids are above the budget of the contracting authority, and that, you know, in a week or two, a bill of omissions is sent around and people are asked to price that. No, that cannot happen, and that should not happen, and that's in breach of procedures if it does. The works requirements cannot be changed. They may be changed, of course, after the contract is awarded, but they can't be changed in negotiation before the contract is awarded. And finally, the award of the contract must be strictly in accordance with the award criteria. And a project awarded under the short form is always the lowest price. And there is not in the short form, as there is in the ordinary GCCs, an adjustment for what's called meat, you know, where you bid rates for the lay and bid rates for labour and machinery and plant and materials. That doesn't exist. That's not part of the short form. It's simply lowest price.